So we have the international co-chair for IDDSI with us today. That's Dr. Julie Cichero. She's going to be presenting the next webinar in a series of 5. So it's webinar 2 today, and it's about the IDDSI Flow Test and liquid levels 0 to 3. The next webinars will continue on through the levels and into the food. And just a reminder, you do need to register for each webinar separately. It's just easier if it happens that way through our registration system. So remember, if you've dialed in today, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be getting the registration details for the next webinar. That I've sent the paperwork through, so it should go up on the web page, and you should get everybody should get an email by the end of the week. So you will need to re-register for that, because the connection details from Julie's end and using the Zoom platform will change as well. So welcome, Julie. Thank you. I'll hand it over to you, and we'll leave questions till the end. I do have some questions, but if anybody else has questions, just jot them down and there will be time for you to bring up your questions later.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Troy, and thank you also for the opportunity to partner with IHHC in providing this webinar series. What I'm going to do at this point is mute everybody, and then we can unmute, or you can unmute yourselves at the end for questions, just to keep our recording nice and clean. What I'm going to do now is start sharing my screen. There we go. So as Troy said, this is our second webinar looking at the IDDSI Flow Test and liquids from levels 0 through to 3. I'd like to just briefly acknowledge both our international sponsors and also the Australian Steering Committee, who are both supporting the implementation of IDDSI. Okay. So when we compare the liquids from the Australian national descriptors with IDDSI, there are a couple of main things that I want to share with you, I guess, and that's firstly that the IDDSI levels are clearly defined by measurement using the flow test for levels 0 to 3 and the fork and spoon tests for level 4. Our Australian levels do broadly match the IDDSI levels, but they were developed, they're predominantly subjective, so you can see the descriptions on the side here. So sits on a spoon and does not flow off it, or drips slowly and dollops off the end of a spoon, or runs freely but leaves a mild coating, for example. So our national descriptors were more subjective rather than specific. It's important that we don't assume that a certain product maps directly across to a certain IDDSI level. So that's why learning about testing is quite important as well. So we have got a bit of a measurement dilemma. One of the things that was put to the International Committee when we were developing the framework was putting into everybody's hands a way of measuring that was accessible. Things like rheometers and viscometers are really expensive. You know, we're talking up to $250,000 for the very highly skilled rheometers, and even other devices like the Bostwick consistometer are still a sizable investment as well. Most of those are too complicated for use in kitchens in order to try and classify liquids. So we needed something that was simpler, but also valid and reliable for measuring thickness at the point of use. And I'll come back to that point again in a moment as well. So the IDDSI Flow Test was developed by the mechanical engineer on our IDDSI board, Dr. Ben Hansen. And the flow test is very similar to a thing called the posthumous funnel, which has been used in the dairy industry to measure liquid thickness for many years now. So the benefits of that are that, or the geometry of the syringe, if you like, allows us to measure both the shear thickness and also elongation as the fluid flows, and those more closely match what's happening in the oral cavity and as we swallow. So in terms of that objective measurement then, it helps us to get around that how thick is the thickness that I look at, you know, when I'm, you know, tilting a glass, for example, the same as what you would call, you know, a particular thickness level. So with IDDSI, we were trying to get around the need for subjective or personal judgments then. So the tests are simple, quick, portable and reliable. While it's possible to perform the tests at any time, you won't need to do the tests every time. So the tests are most useful for initial staff training when you're doing your auditing, industry use to develop and test products, and also kitchen use when you're developing and testing recipes. So we're particularly looking in this webinar at the types of liquids that you might put through the flow test, so through the syringe then. So they are level 0, thin, the slightly thick, mildly thick, moderately thick and liquidized. And just a reminder that liquidized and moderately thick sit together because they share the same flow properties. It doesn't mean that if someone is prescribed a moderately thick that they are automatically prescribed liquidized food, just that they share the same properties there. The other thing that I think that the IDDSI Flow Test helps us to remember is that we can measure a range of liquids. So it might be water, milk, tea, coffee, nutritional supplements, naturally thick liquids like some fruit nectars or smoothies or milkshakes, but also thickened drinks, thickened milk for infants, also into things like soups, sauces, gravies, and even liquid medicines. The IDDSI Flow Test then, just as a reminder, was designed to test liquids the way they move when they're swallowed. We do use a particular syringe, and so all of our calibration details are based around a syringe that measures 61.5 millimetres from the 0 line through to the 10 millilitre line. So it is important to check that, because otherwise there are some variations. We know that there's one brand of syringe, for example, that markets itself as a 10 ml syringe, but when you purchase it, it in fact has 12 millilitre markings on it, and the barrel length is a different diameter, which means that the measurements that you get from it won't match up with the IDDSI measurements. I've included on here the schematic of the instructions there on what you do to do the flow test. So you take the plunger out, you cover, use your finger to cover the nozzle, use another 10 ml syringe to pour the liquid into the 10 millilitre line, release the nozzle and start your timer, and stop the timer at 10 seconds to read how much is left. So this particular chart is available on the IDDSI website, but we're also going to watch a video where Ben will take us through that. A couple of tips to start with. So first of all, ensuring that you're using the correct syringe. And I've included on the right-hand side here the code for Australia. So it's a BD reference number 302143, 10 millilitre slip tip syringe. The next thing to do is to check that the nozzle is free from manufacturing defects. Like all plastics, you can end up with a tiny bit of plastic over the end. The quickest and most simplest way to check that your nozzle is free from any kind of manufacturing default, or even if you've used the syringe before and you want to, you've cleaned it and you wish to reuse it to make sure that there's no residue in there, is to put 10 millilitres of water into the syringe, and it should flow completely through the syringe in 7 seconds. And that's also another way of testing that you've got the right syringe. When you're putting liquids through the syringe, it's important to make sure there are no lumps, no clumps, no bits, no seeds or pips, because they will all block the flow of the liquid coming out. It's also very important, if you're testing thickened liquids, to make sure you follow your manufacturer's instructions for preparation. So I'll play now for you the flow test instruction video. This is available on the IDDSI website as well.
Get a stopwatch and some 10 ml slip tip syringes. Remove the plunger from one syringe and discard. Cover the nozzle of the syringe with your finger, making a seal. Fill the syringe up to the 10 millilitre line with fluid. It's recommended to use another syringe to do this. Remove your finger from the nozzle end at the same time as starting the stopwatch. At 10 seconds, replace your finger over the nozzle, stopping the liquid flowing.
So the other thing to think about as well with that is what kind of liquid that you're planning to test. So if you've got something that's quite thick already, it's possible that it's not suitable for the syringe. So just bearing that in mind as well. Why do we use thick drinks? And I think this is probably something else that is important to include here. So I've got just a couple of videos. They're very short, but show video fluoroscopy. So moving x-rays where we can see people who have swallowing difficulties and what happens when they try and drink normal drinks. So the black stuff is the liquid going down. That element has gone down into the esophagus, but this portion down the front here has gone down into the airway, causing that person to cough. In this video, the person also has difficulty swallowing. This time the material goes into the airway, but they don't cough. So the clinicians will work out which thickness level is safest for the person. And those, their needs will vary. Not every person requires the same level of thickness. So what IDDSI has done then, we've got our different thickness levels, and what I'm going to go through now is each one individually. So our level 0 or thin, this thickness flows like water or milk or tea or coffee. It could be drunk through any type of teat or nipple, cup or straw, as appropriate for that person's age and skills, because this is both an adult and a paediatric framework. Why is it used? So this particular one obviously is okay for anyone to use. So you need the ability to manage all types of liquids safely. The thin liquids flow the most quickly. So there should be nothing remaining after 10 seconds of flow. Water should run completely through the syringe within 7 seconds. The slightly thick level, this thickness level is thicker than water. It flows through a straw, teat, nipple or syringe. It's used if thin drinks flow too quickly for patients to swallow it safely. It's mainly used in the paediatric population and is the thickness level roughly of anti-regurgitation formula. Our mildly thick liquids, so these are thicker again, they are sippable from a cup, and you need some effort to drink this thickness using a standard straw. They're used if thin drinks and also the level 1 slightly thick drinks flow too quickly to be swallowed safely, again at the discretion of the clinician. Okay, so we've got a measurement there which shows it's leaving between 4 and 8 millilitres remaining after 10 seconds of flow. Moderately thick liquids can be drunk from a cup or taken with a spoon. So these are thicker again. We need some effort to drink this thickness using a wide diameter straw. And again, we'll use this type of liquid if thin drinks like water and milk or level 1 slightly thick or level 2 mildly thick are flowing too quickly to be swallowed safely. Again, each of these little videos are available on the IDDSI website, and they're also available through the app as well. So I've got some questions here that I've been asked a number of times, so I thought I'd share those with you, and then we can, at the end of these, we can turn over to other questions. So one of the questions I'm often asked is, what happens if the remaining liquid falls exactly on the 4 millilitre line, for example, for the boundary between slightly thick and mildly thick, or the 8 millilitre line for the boundary between mildly thick and moderately thick? And what that means is that the liquid is neither one level or the other. It's actually falling exactly in between the two different levels. So if you specifically want a slightly thick liquid, then you need to make the level, the liquid thinner, or you make it thicker. So you change it to make it fit within the range rather than sitting on the border, or you accept that it is sitting on the border basically. How many times should I do the flow test on a liquid? We recommend doing the flow test a minimum of 2 times to check for product stability, and if you've got more than 1 millilitre of variation across those 2 times, to do it a 3rd time, and that's to allow to correct for any lumps or bubbles that might be in the syringe, for example. Does temperature testing matter? Yes, 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 it absolutely does. So we recommend that you test the liquid at the intended serving temperature. The manufacturers, certainly for your pre-thickened liquids, might also advise you of what they intend their serving temperature to be. So it's important at this point to understand that thick liquids have always varied according to temperature. It's just that we now have a tool that's quite sensitive to show you that this is happening. I am aware, for example, that clinicians might take a pre-thickened drink and take it from the refrigerator, and at the beginning of their ward rounds it's still chilled, but perhaps after two hours or more it has changed to room temperature. So what we typically find is that with a cold liquid it tends to be thicker, and once it's hit room temperature it will be thinner. So in terms of manufacturing, the manufacturer really just needs to hit the point of the intended serving temperature. If you choose to use it outside of that intended serving temperature, then you need to be aware of what thickness level you're actually using there as well. How often should I use the flow test to test a liquid thickness? Now again, initial staff training, it's going to be really important, and then after that, as you would with any standard audit procedures at your facility. So if you already do daily testing or weekly testing or spot testing at your facility, that's when we'd recommend that you continue to use the IDDSI Flow Test. You might also find that it's beneficial when you're developing and testing new recipes as well, to make sure that they are at a particular thickness level. The other question I'm being asked is where I can buy IDDSI compliant 10 ml syringes in Australia. So again, I've got the BD reference that is specific to Australia, because we know that different regions of the world have different BD reference codes. So I've had advice from BD here in Australia that national online ordering is available through this group, through Team Medical. You can also phone order to these 3 companies here, EBOS, CH2 and Vital Medical Supplies, and they ship Australia-wide. And then AMA products, you can certainly order from Queensland for that. We have a range of resources available on the IDDSI website. So again, if you're training staff, you may find that the flow test cards are beneficial for you. So these look like this. They're little business cards. They're printed with a gloss finish on them. So IDDSI doesn't have the capacity to print and ship out to you, but what we have done is we have employed the services of a graphic artist to create print-ready business cards. We've also discovered that there's no standardisation in business card size around the world, so we've got different ones for Australia, Canada, the UK and the USA. So if you click on the Australian PDF, you'll be able to download that, and then you can choose to take that graphic to your printer of choice and print resources, so that you've got a series of flow test cards that can be quite handy there. So the benefits of those flow test cards is that you've got a measurement tool along the side there to check your syringe is the correct length. You've got a ready reference tool here for your level 0, level 1, level 2, level 3, and a reminder that at level 4 we switch across to using the fork test and the spoon tilt test. And on the back of the card you've got the instructions there that are so that they're always handy and easy to use. You can pop them in your pocket. A reminder as well that all of the videos that I've shown today and even detailed descriptions about the IDDSI levels are available from the app that is both, where there is an iOS version on the in the App Store and also an Android version through Google Play. So I'll turn over now and actually allow you to ask some questions. And if you've got other questions later on, or if you'd like to join the mailing list, I'd encourage you to contact me at australia@idsi.org.
Okay, so does anybody have any questions? Thank you, Julie, for that presentation. I have a question. Julie, I have a question here about, one question about the flow test. There's often bubbles found in thickened fluids, and bubbles can be an issue. Are bubbles an issue for the accuracy of the flow test given, and how small the syringe nozzle is? And what I was wondering then is if there is, like if you're looking at thickened carbonated drinks or melted ice cream and things like that, how does that work? Are those bubbles going to cause dramas with trying to get what level you're supposed to be, or how do you do that?
So if you've got, I'll take a step back and say, if you've got a liquid that you've mixed up yourself and you can see some little bubbles in it, it's better to wait for them to settle. Yes, so the bubbles are going to sort of hold the fluid up a little bit as they try and drip through the syringe. There are some challenges with carbonated beverages. So things like beer, for example, what tends to happen is the thickener interacts with the foam at the top and leaves the liquid portion unthickened. So you have a separation that occurs there. So it's important. I mean, you can actually see that by looking at it as well. Yep.
So, so in that instance, I suppose, are we looking? Does it really boil down to then, if we have bubbles, we have to wait for the bubbles to settle, or do you have to try and tap them out? But if it is a bubbly drink anyway, does that mean that the IDDSI Flow Test is probably not going to be that accurate for that product?
I will defer to Ben. I'll get some further advice from him actually on that, and organise an answer through. Yep. Okay.
Yeah. So it's particularly just about. I can send the question to you, Julie. So it's particularly about like, is the flow test not suitable for thickened carbonated drinks or melted ice cream? That would be the question.
Since the webinar, I've had an opportunity to speak with Dr. Ben Hansen, mechanical engineer from the University College London. Ben advises that yes, the IDDSI Flow Test can be used for carbonated drinks or melted ice cream. These are foams, and so it really depends on the type and the quantity of the bubbles in the sample. If there are a few bubbles and the liquid is pourable, then it can definitely be put through the IDDSI Flow Test, and the liquid might be classified as level 1, 2 or 3. If there are so many bubbles that it won't flow at all, then it might be in that gap between level 3 and 4 where there is no classification. Or it could be like a level 4 mousse if it also passes the IDDSI fork test and spoon tilt test. It could also potentially be a transitional texture if it's something like cappuccino foam. So if it's left for long enough in the mouth, then those bubbles burst and it reverts back to plain milk. So these are all options for you to consider.
I have another question. I think, Julie, you and I have spoken about this. So we're all clear. The IDDSI standards are voluntary.
They are voluntary in exactly the same way that the current Australian standards were also and have been voluntary for 10 years now.
Okay.
So all of it is voluntary. From a safety perspective, that's what's coming in. We have got support from independent sources. So there's a report that's out that was authored by a professor of forensic medicine, looking at a reduction of preventable deaths in aged care, that was published just last year, where he recommends, one of his recommendations, number 20, is the implementation of IDDSI to improve safety.
Okay, yeah. And I know that you and I have had this discussion, but just probably so people online are clear as well. And it's about making application to appropriate government bodies, like, and our discussion, I think, was on the phone one day that, yes, if it's voluntary, and we know that others have been voluntary as well, you've explained that. Is it the intention, and you might be not able to answer this, but is it the intention to get some endorsement behind the IDDSI from health jurisdictions, or some support, or what's the appetite there from the IDDSI steering committee, or even you as the project officer?
So the project officer position is supported at 8 hours a week. So, and my brief with that is to develop resources and to assist with communication and education.
Yeah.
So, to try and lobby government bodies within that 8 hours is a challenge, and it was discussed at the most recent steering committee meeting, with the decision made that we would put the resources that are available to developing resources to make it easier for people to implement, and providing communication and education sessions, where opportunities exist to talk to government bodies. Certainly, we're happy to do that, and I'll be attending a meeting in a couple of weeks' time in association with the Lantern Project, where there will be a group of different government providers, and so there will be an opportunity then to talk to them. But where we're really constrained by the number of hours that are available to do that.
Okay.
Yep.
And I know, well, I don't know, but from your perspective, I'm certain you've raised some of those things with the steering committee anyway, and are they looking into that, or is that the advice that they've been given, like you've been given back, that it's to be just focusing on resources at the moment?
That's right. So because it is 8 hours a week, by the time I develop resources and get them communicated out there, or even developing the slides to go into a webinar or whatever, that's where the priority for this is.
From the people online, is there any feedback that you have received from your management, your powers to be, your jurisdiction that you're working under? And I know there's some health share people online, and there might be some other people online. And I've just got a question come up, so I'll finish asking this question, and then Julie, you might see this chat as well.
Yeah,
actually,
I can.
it's on to everybody, yeah. So, but what I want to gauge from people is, have your workplaces indicated any issues, difficulties, positiveness? I'm just trying to grab a cross-section of comments from anybody that you guys are working for. Are they starting to look at moving towards the IDDSI, or is there definitely a feeling back from your organisation that no, they won't be moving towards it and won't be implementing it by the 1st of May 2019? Can I just get some feedback from people that are on the line, please?
I can speak from Central Adelaide Health Service, that network. Certainly their focus is implementing.
Great. Thank you.
So Julie, there's that first question, I think, and it's gone to everybody. Have these
Yep.
standards been implemented in healthcare institutions? Has IDDSI received any feedback on the ease of applicability and analysis of food and drinks on a daily basis or regular basis of sorts?
Yes. Okay, so what I can do is share with you information there about where IDDSI has been implemented in hospitals overseas. So we have feedback from a children's hospital in California. They were 9 months from beginning to end of implementation. They found they spent a lot of time in education, but found it to be very beneficial. In terms of the applicability, the ease of applicability and the analysis of foods and drinks on a daily basis was reasonable. In fact, they termed the coin testing for safety in 10 seconds or less. So whether that's with the flow test or with the spoon tilt test or the fork test. So they found it very user-friendly. They found it easy to implement. To the point where they had catering staff who were delivering meals who were able to identify and pick up near misses where patients had been delivered incorrect meals or incorrect thickness levels, who could spot check it and test it and alert people so that that person's safety was maintained. So certainly we have that information. As I say, that's one hospital. We've had other hospitals. We've got some groups who've chosen to do their implementation in a staggered format. So some groups, for example, who've chosen to look at just the thick fluids, and once they've got that all sorted, then they're moving on to managed foods, for example, and others who are going vice versa. We've got, I know that the UK is also in the process of implementation, and I'll be checking in with their group in the coming weeks to see how they're going there.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. Does that answer that question? I'm just on this chat having a look. So I'll go back to I just want to add, people have commented here that Marta Brisbane is in the planning stages. HealthShare New South Wales are looking at implementing by 1/5/19 and have a working party. From a Queensland Health perspective, there is a steering committee that's looking at IDDSI at the moment. I'm not certain what's happening with that. It is sitting under our jurisdiction at the moment, but a project that we've been working on is probably pulling resources from that IDDSI stuff at the moment. So I think that's moving back towards the speech pathology areas of Queensland Health. I know Denise, my colleague, has been working on some documentation about that in the last couple of days. So I'm not certain where that's headed to at the moment. Monash Health are saying that they're planning to implement the IDDSI classification for fluids and foods to replace the current national standards. There's a couple questions here. There's one from Brenda. When using powder thickeners like xanthan, as they hydrate, they form slight transparent drops similar to pulp. Will these affect results in STS, and is a hold step recommended?
So I'm not sure what STS is, but what I would say with that, when using any kind of thickening agent, again, make sure that you follow your manufacturer's instructions, mix it thoroughly together, and there's often a standard waiting time of at least a couple of minutes, sometimes 5 minutes. What I know with my research hat on, is that protein-based liquids take a little bit longer to thicken, so you might be better to wait, in fact, for 10 minutes for it to stabilise. Once that's happened, then you can certainly use the flow test. There was one other one just before that too, Troy. So it says, hi there, can you please elaborate on the validation method for the syringe test? Was it validated against the rheometer and or the Bostwick? So a couple of points there. So the flow test, as I said, the posthumous funnel is a well recognised in the engineering literature. And that's what it's modelled on. The rheometer has a number of qualifications, if you like, in terms of its accuracy. It has an accuracy of, or a tolerance range of 4%. I have information from Dr. Hansen most recently that the flow test also has a tolerance range of 4%. So it's a very accurate little device. The Bostwick flow test, you need a number of repetitions on that. It has some limitations in terms of the types of liquids. It was actually developed for use with purees and that sort of thing. So thicker things like tomato paste, things that actually don't flow spectacularly quickly. Different things are used for different purposes. IDDSI is in the process of doing some testing that will be published as well to provide that information. But really, it's important to recognise that this wasn't a tool that was sort of dreamt up by someone with no knowledge in the field. It was developed by a well-recognised and well-respected mechanical engineer based on sound literature. Yep.
Troy, you might know the answer to this, I'm not sure, as far as any discussions with procurement, etc., around suppliers of the manufactured drinks. Has that got legs, or is there, I don't know, a force driving that on the eastern seaboard?
Look, from a Queensland Health perspective, we're working very closely with the procurement people that look after SOA 68, which is the Queensland Health standing offer arrangement. 68 is for thickened fluids. So those procurement people from a Queensland Health perspective are working very closely with current providers and also with the speech pathology clinical leads in the state. I know Julie will be able to answer, and it's better coming from Julie, with respect to manufacturers and how they are represented on the steering committee. Julie, do you want to respond to the remainder of that question?
So the manufacturers are, they're working very hard to, well, they've already done a lot of testing, done their own internal testing, as you might imagine. The groups that are on the steering committee, the manufacturers there are Nestle Health Science, Precise Thicken, and also Flavour Creations. So all of those groups are working towards implementation as part of the steering committee for 1 May 2019.
So, Wendy, on behalf of Queensland Health, I can't respond and say what we're doing because it's clearly a huge organisation. But with respect to what people are doing and the interaction between the purchasing hub and the manufacturers, there is discussion. It will be dependent on what the clinicians recommend or what we have the capacity to do, and whether it's going to be a 1/5/19 implementation date. Having said that, I know that there is a purchasing group that join together and chat often, and the lead for that purchasing group from all the health jurisdictions is actually sitting with us in our area at the moment. And I know that there's representatives from, well, obviously Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia. And I think there's also representatives from New Zealand on that. So they are purchasing people. I can't remember the name of the committee, but the purchasing people in SA Health should be represented on that. And I think they are, and therefore they should be getting some knowledge. But I think it's not necessarily just about thickened drinks. It's about a lot of things.
Yeah. Thanks.
So Fiona Stanley in Western Australia saying we have formed a working party to look at implementation and mapping our current dishes to the new standards. We use pre-thickened drinks, so we'll be influenced by industry in terms of an implementation date. So I'm assuming from that comment that if the industry has exhausted or they've chosen to change over the products and they can no longer get the old or the current standards or labelling on the products, they would go with that date or a date that's set by industry. With my assumption from that comment. And then Julie, there's another question here. Do the IDDSI levels 1 to 3 directly correlate with the Australian standards 150, 400 and 900?
So there's a general correlation, but not necessarily a direct correlation. If you were to look at the current range of pre-thickened drinks that are currently on the marketplace and you were to do testing with them, you would find that there is some variability already existing there, and that's because that we had subjective descriptions there. We now have some objective measures there, so it's important to that those numbers will provide you with a general indication, but you'll still need to do just some initial auditing to check how they map across. And as I say, just be mindful also that temperature has an effect. There's a nutritional supplement that looks like a thickened liquid and has been debated by speech pathologists, as to whether or not it requires a thickener, for example, and you find when it's chilled it does actually fall within a thickened liquid range. When it's at room temperature it doesn't. So just also being mindful of the temperature variation there.
And then she said there's variables anyway.
Yeah.
So I have a question, Julie. Another question. Actually, let me just go right back a bit. If we're a jurisdiction or we're a company and we're buying thickened fluids in from an external provider, i.e. one of the manufacturers, would we be needing to use the syringe test on an ongoing basis, or would it just be because we want to try test the thickness to verify that the thickness is actually correct against whatever it's supposed to be? Or is this specifically more with the syringe test if we're going to be thickening our own fluids in our own facilities?
Look, certainly if you're thickening within your own institution or facility, it's quite important because we know that there's variability as people make them up. But in terms of pre-thickened drinks, they would be, I guess, for spot testing with, potentially batch-to-batch variability. Occasionally even with grocery board items, you might notice some variability and you might choose to take it back to the store if it's not as you'd expect it. For example, with our patients, we obviously have a higher degree of safety that we're looking at. So whatever your usual auditing procedure, sort of would be, I guess, is what you would carry through with that. But I guess it's just you could use it even for teaching purposes with patients. If they're going home, you could use a pre-thickened drink to help educate them as to what the thickness level is, for example. So there are a whole range of ways that you could use them.
Okay.
I can see the challenges in relation to sources, and certainly a fresh cook that can do their testing even prior to a line to make sure it's going on versus a source then going to a chill, plated cold, and then the retherm process. I can see there'll be some challenges in the consistency of the, alignment.
Yeah, and I suppose I can hear what you're saying, Wendy. With that, you'd want to be doing the testing from the standard recipes, and that there would need to then be verification that the standard recipe was always followed. And some of that is coming up with a lot of allergen work I'm doing at the moment and ensuring that patients get allergen-free meals, and that would simply be by a documentation that a chef or a cook has signed off to say they have, nearly hand on heart or blood on stone, followed the standard recipe, because then the standard recipe for the chilled product would be tested, but then you'd have to test that when it's been rethermed. And I know some of, or if not all of your hospitals are, cold plating, particularly the new RA. So you'd then be checking that rethermed gravy or sauce to see what thickness it was at and whether it was at the right consistency for who the patient, the correct patient.
We've got another question here. So thank you to this one from Flavour Creation. So we've heard concerns that 4 or even 5 ml liquid remaining in the syringe are too thin for mildly thick, much thinner than what's currently in the market. How have you verified that allowing thickened fluids is safe for people on this thickness level? So that's a question that actually comes back to, how were the ranges set, if you like? And those ranges were set based on manufacturers' instructions from a whole range of different manufacturers and providers internationally. So what you see there is the current variability that exists around the world for mildly thick, moderately thick, extremely thick. So if you, from a clinical perspective, if clinicians decide that, that they're not happy with 4 mil, well, as I say, 4 mil actually sits completely on the borders, so that is in fact not mildly thick anyway. But if they decide that 5 mil isn't the correct thickness level for their patients, they can certainly specify that they want it 6 mil or 7 mil, and obviously they've got some opportunities to do that with a as they thicken it themselves, for example. We have seen that as validated on video fluoroscopy again overseas, where clinicians were able to test different thickness levels and tailor it to specific patients. So that's a possibility also.
So I would imagine, Julie, that if it's a jurisdiction, say an organisation, and they're putting in a contract, instead of, and they're doing an evaluation, instead of what they've previously done with the current standards, or even if they stay with the current standards or whatever, but if they're checking fluids and evaluating, it's going to be using this now, like they can use the syringe to check and do it against the IDDSI standards. And I would imagine that would be if the product they're getting in and they're evaluating against is using the IDDSI standards, correct?
Look, I think that will actually depend a little bit. So one of the things that the steering committee has commented on, as well, as far as tenders, etc., it's possible that organisations could choose to write into their tenders. So, you know, I'm aware that they run often for a 2 or 3 year time period, that from 1st of May 2019 that the products would need to meet IDDSI levels. So that's certainly a possibility there. Yep.
And look, it's going to be dependent, I suppose, with some of those big jurisdictions. Like if Queensland Health were to say they were going to do this, that's going to probably affect a lot of, or, you know, current providers in the market, because it's a huge, if it's probably not that huge, but, you know, it's still a huge market. Whereas if it's just a small individual nursing home that may thicken their own or buy a few products in, that the effect on them may be determined on supplier demand. So therefore their provider might not have moved over. But if, I suppose from what you're saying, this, the Australian Steering Committee is that all of those major companies are on the steering committee, and there's collaboration there and working towards a common goal, we probably could see some of those products changing over by that time.
Certainly, so I was just going to say, the companies have certainly asked that if people have got particular questions about exactly what, you know, when their products are going to change their labels over, if you contact them directly. Can I also, there are just a couple more questions that have popped up there. Yeah. Is there data about the Mille Pascal seconds each IDDSI level measures at 25 degrees? Okay, so 25 degrees is room temperature. So if you want to serve the liquid or the sauce or whatever at room temperature, then that's the correct temperature to use. But if you want to serve it chilled, then you need to measure it at 4 degrees, for example. We are not actually looking to correlate IDDSI with Mille Pascal seconds. As I explained, they're quite, they're both accurate tools. You will start to see some literature coming out where there has been some testing done with rheometers, etc. But please be very careful about the temperature there, because it's at the intended serving temperature. Just because it's in range at 25 degrees doesn't mean it's going to be in range at 4 degrees or even 60 degrees when it's heated. We realise the thickness level is temperature dependent, but shouldn't the temperature reflect the temperature in the patient's mouth? The answer to that is no, actually. So saliva has a role in the person's mouth of adjusting temperature. So when you have a cup of coffee or some hot soup, the role of saliva is to cool that so that you don't burn the oral membrane. If you have something very cold like ice cream, the role of saliva is to warm it. again, so that it's more comfortable for the oral cavity there. We also had so much variation around that it's actually the time that it spends in the mouth before you swallow it down. In a healthy person is, sort of 1 to 2 seconds for liquids. In people with swallowing difficulties, it could be up to 10 seconds. I think as I'm talking, hopefully you can hear that there's going to be some variation that's there for individuals, and that's where you really need your clinical assistance to sort those things out.
I don't see any more questions popping up. Can you give us a brief, Julie, on what the next webinar we're touching on in that one?
Certainly. So on Tuesday, the 4th of September, we're going to be looking specifically at the fork drip test and the spoon tilt test. And we're going to be looking at ways of differentiating level 3 mildly thick or liquidized from level 4 extremely thick and pureed.
Excellent.
Yep.
Sounds good.